Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Clarke, and my research is A is for Adderall, Moralizations of Illicit Prescription Stimulant Use in College. Before we get started, there is some vocab that's pretty frequently used throughout the presentation. First is illicit drug use, which is the non-medical use of drugs or using a drug that's illegal. Recreational drug use, which is the non-medical drug use done occasionally on the basis of enjoyment or when one is not working. And then deviance, which is just when an individual or group departs from the accepted social standards. So, the most important context that guided this research was understanding the main ways that individuals rationalize their behavior to the same social system that taught them it was deviant. And that starts with what Gresham Sykes and David Matza call neutralization techniques. Before Sykes and Matza, the main social theory out there was that when deviance happens, it's because the values of an individual directly opposes the more widely held values of their respective society. And neutralization theory challenges this by saying that it's unlikely a person behaving deviantly hasn't internalized any normative values, but rather they work to rationalize their behaviors with consideration to those norms. Neutralization techniques can be denying responsibility, denying that the behavior had harm involved, as well as saying the behavior came from a place of survival, etc. This leads to the second, as well as more contemporary piece of context, which is the literature reviews that expand upon neutralization theory by seeing how these rationalizations apply to drug use. When it comes to these techniques and substance use, most work either discusses cannabis or alcohol consumption. However, with the writing on prescription stimulants that is out there, the main observed neutralization technique that comes out of it is the comparison of illicit prescription stimulant use to other recreational drug use. So the majority of existing work emphasizes these justifications individuals have, which is very important considering the nuance it provides when understanding how people interact with these social boundaries. However, it also points to an area that merits more attention, which is how these individual level rationalizations, as well as their various efficiencies, not only reflect but also potentially influence the boundaries of their social environments. And because the application of these deviance theories to Adderall are so sparse, it's possible that there could be more to add to the work that's already been done. And in setting up this project, the goal was to be able to go into interviews with a combination of good, time-tested, foundational theoretical frameworks that were then complemented by more contemporary research that would be more specifically focused on stimulants. And that led to openly structured interviews with the goals of letting participants lead the interview. And what that led to was the main question that guided this research, which was, what roles do social groups play in informing how college students define acceptable versus unacceptable illicit prescription stimulant use? And that then was broken down into three main themes we're going to take a closer look at. The first one is basically why to want it. This question seeks to answer what main areas of an individual's social ecosystem are influencing their perceptions and desires surrounding Adderall. The second question was where to get it, and this aims to gain insight around socializations that happen with how these drugs are being circulated. And the third and last category was how to do it. This references to the preferences of brands of stimulants, as well as preferences of where and how these stimulants are being taken. Throughout investigating these questions, the criteria for what determined how deviant the type of use was emerged. And this is what those distinctions were. So all of these differentiations could be seen throughout all three themes. However, each theme had certain distinctions that were more apparent than others. In the first theme, the three main social environments that informed a person's perceptions of these drugs was their peer group, their school environment, and their family. Coming out of the friend-based incentives, we see that Adderall use is acceptable when it is used to gain respect and value within a person's social group. And with participants that were being primarily influenced by their friends, Adderall was being viewed as an academic performance enhancer. This meant to people that Adderall was something that would give them a leg up, allowing them to outperform their peers through maintaining higher grades. The thing informing this competitive mindset was a desire to maintain value and respect in their social group. Academic incentivization was a little different. While in friend groups, Adderall was viewed as an enhancer, academics positioned it to be a maximizer. What that differentiation meant was people taking Adderall purely motivated from their academic environments positioned Adderall to be a tool that allowed more academic content to be produced within a shorter period of time. Higher risk usage patterns were most strongly associated with this category as well, which meant students using stimulants for classwork were using these drugs in higher amounts more frequently. Lastly, family-based incentives had a strong emphasis on what situations would be seen as more respectable when it came to an individual taking these drugs. People who had their parents pay for college often viewed Adderall use as okay because they rationalized it as a way to pay back their family and show them that they made the right choice supporting their child. Looking at what social processes occur throughout the second theme, we see that it can quickly be divided into drugs being obtained inside the healthcare system versus outside. Talking to interviewees about their experiences and perspectives on getting stimulants, the idea of what usage patterns were more likely to be associated as safe and legal began to emerge when we looked at inside the healthcare industry. With safety specifically, participants explained that they felt safer knowing the drugs they were taking were coming right from a pharmacy. And this is where legality came up a lot as well. Interviewees that didn't have a prescription did not exhibit much discretion to where they took their Adderall and who saw them taking it. And often the reasoning for this is they would explain, if someone did ask, they would simply say it's their own medication. The circulation of prescription stimulants outside the healthcare system also emphasizes the value of familiarity. When people were getting stimulants, the more steps there were to trace a drug back to the pharmacy it came from, the more people were placing value on trust. When an individual was friends with the person they were getting stimulants from, these interactions were being characterized as one person doing a quick favor for the other. And if not for free, these drugs are being sold for very little money compared to less familiar interactions. And that created the question of what constitutes a drug dealer. Drug dealers were characterized as people who were usually older, who sold other substances alongside stimulants and weren't fellow U of O students. When someone got their Adderall from a peer, this was a quick exchange. When they got it from a dealer, it was seen as more of a process. And because the less familiar the individual was with the person they were getting stimulants from, the more the interaction was framed as a drug deal. And that was a lot more likely to be frowned upon. Shifting towards context of use, we see the focus on brand preferences as well as the environments these drugs were being taken in. The top three most mentioned brands in interviews were Adderall, Vyvanse, and Ritalin. Ritalin, though, was being brought up, usually not in a favorable light. When people did talk about it, it was often described to be choppy, harsh, and undesirable. Vyvanse, on the other hand, was understood to be a really high quality stimulant, receiving descriptors such as clean as well as smooth. This was similar to Adderall, which was one of the most popular, both in its extended release form as well as its instant release form, which, while instant release was more highly associated with parties, extended release was more associated with academics. And that leads us to the idea of recreational versus non-recreational use. In discussing the context of use, people who didn't identify as recreational users really emphasized that when they were taking these drugs, they weren't having fun. And more so, there was a generally shared sentiment that if someone who was using Adderall was doing it in an unproductive way, it was seen as more deviant. So throughout these three themes, there's an emergence of how unacceptable versus acceptable stimulant use is being defined. And looking at these distinctions on their own and together, there was one that stood out the most. And it was because of how it solidified this reoccurring question of if and how the definitions of illicit versus recreational interact, and more so, how unauthorized stimulant use fits within those two categories. And that distinction was productive versus pleasurable use. What initially emerged from the third theme was the observation that if use was understood to be productive, it often superseded all other characterizations. Even if they got a substance from a drug dealer and took it in a high-risk manner, if the person was still doing well in school, their behaviors were often overlooked. With that being said, though, even the most productive typologies of illicit stimulant use, they're still illicit. But these individuals also weren't taking Adderall to relax after a long day either. And in fact, individuals would assert that they looked down on people who had fun taking these stimulant drugs. So it didn't feel right to distinguish this as recreational use either. Knowing how important distinguishing productivity from pleasure is, we see determining the acceptability of drug use almost always coincided with assigning meaning to recreational drug use. So now knowing this, we get a kind of spectrum of morality. This graph demonstrates the bigger picture of this project by allowing us to start to figure out where each differentiation would fit within this picture. More importantly, though, it opens the question of why productivity and pleasure play such a big role in the cultural landscape that is illicit prescription stimulant use. Having said this, we're led to the bigger takeaways of this project, which first is the idea that the inclusion of productivity when negotiating the deviance of someone's usage is a neutralization technique that can be added to the pre-existing rationalizations that authors like Sykes and Matza outline. The second is the introduction of the phrase productive use. Rather than simply functioning as this concrete category sitting right between recreational and illicit, the social category of productive use provides us the analytical space we previously lacked to understand why some illegal drugs and drug use behaviors do or don't get defined as illicit or recreational. We're learning that the negotiations of social boundaries surrounding prescription stimulants are just as diverse, if not more, than the ones that take place amongst other drugs. We're also starting to understand the implication of Adderall and how Adderall being seen in social environments other drugs aren't has its differences. This gives insight into how rationalizations of stimulant use interact with social boundaries and reflect their importance. What these ideas also do is demonstrate how much more investigation there needs to be, and therefore will be done. Thank you for listening.